welcome back to Talking Politics with the Post Millennial. We have a rather strange episode today, coming from my apartment in Montreal. But to make up for that, we have a really exciting guest, and that's Rempel Garner. Michelle is a Conservative MP for Calgary-Nose. You have served in Harper's cabinet. You have numerous shadow cabinet positions over the past few years, and I think you're probably one of the more popular Conservative MPs, certainly on social media. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So how have you been dealing with the lockdown? What's it like for an MP?
Well, I think that there's just a very pressing need to help the community. So that's been the first and foremost goal for me. I think my team was well positioned to continue to deliver service because I've got a fairly cohesive team of staff that work really hard and are used to working, via Zoom and are fairly integrated across the country. So, again, having reach in social media has allowed me to both hold the government to account and provide information and services to my community. So, for me, it's really been a question about ensuring that the gravity of my role is not lost in the middle of this crisis, and that I'm still doing my job to the best of my ability with the physical distancing limitations that have been provided to us. So all is well. It's been very busy, but that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it must be quite strange, right? Because the role of an MP depends so much on actually meeting with people and seeing people and visiting them, especially or welcoming them into your constituency office and so on. So yeah, is there any way you can continue those tasks during a pandemic?
I'm meeting with at least a dozen different groups per day right now. It's at least 12-hour days. My staff have been taking meetings over video conferencing. I've been meeting with proactively meeting with all my community groups. I'm in the process of launching a virtual town hall. My only worry is the people that I'm not hearing from the perspective of people that might not have access to or are limited by this type of technology. And I think that's a challenge for everyone, and not just in politics, is how are we reaching members of our community that don't interact this way. This is why I have always put out mailers, like hard copy mailers into my ridings, or had physical town halls, because there's a segment of the community that's how they communicate. So that's my one worry. But other than that, switching to this type of a format has been good, and I've had good responses. Obviously it's not ideal, but it's been working.
Yeah.
As best. Everybody's just trying to make do, right? So.
Yeah. Well, how do you think the Trudeau government has been handling the coronavirus pandemic? Do you think they've been doing a good job?
Okay, let's start by unpacking the Team Canada approach, right? So you'll hear Trudeau talking about, well, we need a Team Canada approach to this. And what he means by that, and how I think the opposition sees that, are two different things. So for Trudeau, a Team Canada approach, that's code for don't question what I'm doing. It is unpatriotic to question what I'm doing. And for us, I think that means working collaboratively to make sure that people are getting the help that they need quickly, as we did with the emergency response benefit, some of the wage subsidies, etc., but also not really letting them get off the hook for some of the issues that we've seen. So I'm very glad that Parliament as a whole, across party lines, we've been able to implement measures to help people in their community in the short term. There are serious questions that need to be asked about how the government responded to this. There will be a time for that. I'm just thinking back to sitting in the House of Commons in January when we were saying, hey, like maybe we should be closing the borders. And it was like, well, we can't do that. Closing borders don't work. And yet, I could list flip-flop after flip-flop, masks, citing that, there was no human to human transmission, diminishing the threat of this, which is now led to, one of the biggest economic crises that Canada's ever seen, and thousands of deaths. So there will be time for that. But what I'm most worried about right now in terms of the government's response is their failure to communicate or plan for an economic recovery or a relaunch. We're starting to see countries like the United States, other countries are well ahead of us in this regard. They're laying plans for the safe, stage-gated approach to bringing people out of mass lockdown. And I'm not, by no means am I saying that we shouldn't be prioritizing efforts to prevent the spread of COVID-19, but we should be looking at best practice internationally that has shown that when you ramp up testing and contact tracing measures while respecting civil liberties, and we can talk about that later, that we don't have to have the measures. We shouldn't be planning for these measures to be permanently in place. It's just not possible. So I think you're going to see a lot of, I've been talking about this for weeks now. I published a thought piece on how we can move forward several weeks ago. But it is very much incumbent upon the government. I think that they have failed to present a plan, and it's incumbent upon them to do that today, not 2 months from now, but today. And that's where my focus of criticism is going to be.
And even with their medical policy, as you said, they said that closing the border doesn't work. They said that wearing masks don't work. And they've been relying, it seems, entirely on the advice of the WHO. Now, do you think in the future, once we get past this, that we need to totally have another look at our relationship to WHO and whether we need to revamp the organization?
Well, I've long been an advocate for the need to reform multilateral organizations to ensure that they are delivering on the scope that they're purported to deliver on, be that the UN or NATO or whatnot. That's a healthy exercise, is to say, we spend a lot of money on this organization. Is it doing what it's supposed to do? And I think that there are serious questions that need to be answered with regard to the WHO's response to COVID-19. Again, just going back to what I said before, I remember when, and this is very recent history, that, the WHO was saying there is no human-to-human evidence of human-to-human transmission. It's like, well, what? Or closing borders don't work. Well, what? Or wearing masks, don't help spread the transmission. Just bananas. And reports today that the Liberals are trying to, under the auspices of helping to keep Canadians safe, censor what Canadians can say with regard to COVID-19, or questioning the efficacy of organizations like the WHO. I think that's very frightening. It's something we should fight against. And of course, we should be asking questions about whether or not I think it's pretty clear that there's some significant policy gaps or judgment gaps in relying solely on information from organizations that have clearly put Canada behind the curve on dealing with this crisis. But again, what I think we have to be seized with right now, it's what I'm hearing from my community, is how am I getting out of my house without contracting COVID-19? How are we restarting the economy? My business is about to shut down. So in terms of the data that we rely upon going forward on those questions, I want to see quantitative, peer-reviewed data. I don't want to just hear one voice, outside of Rideau Cottage telling us everything's okay without seeing data. And just saying, don't worry, we're relying on WHO, without seeing that. And the nice thing is, it's not just me as a politician demanding that. I think you're starting to see the tide shift in the medical community, even just in the editorial community as well, saying there's a problem here. We've made some poor decisions, and we can't repeat that decision-making process as we move forward. So long answer to your question. Yeah, we can do better.
Right. And you spoke a bit about civil liberties too. Do you think the government has gone too far, that they've overreached their mandate?
Well, I'm concerned about civil liberties moving forward right now. So um, we've managed to get the government to agree to have the industry committee meet via video conference. And I participated in my first video conference parliamentary committee yesterday. It was the health committee. And we had a junior official, like they sent a junior official to our committee from industry. And I was asking some pretty pointed questions about what privacy framework the government is putting in place to ensure that individual privacy isn't violated under contact tracing, potential contact tracing systems. Because we've seen other countries around the world succeed in contact tracing efforts, but they don't have the same tradition of civil liberties that our country does. And I don't want the narrative on this to become false, a false one, which is that we have to give up civil liberties to deploy contact tracing methodology. So in order for us to not see that happen, we have to have that discussion on the front end before this technology is deployed. And so this is why I've been pressing government officials on this issue. And I would hope that Canadians of all political stripe can agree, like, some of the stories that we've seen, like out of South Korea, where, an individual's entire background and whereabouts is displayed to the public, or like, it's just, or if we're going to employ third parties to manage this stuff, what are they doing with that data? How long are they holding it for? What's the oversight mechanisms? And those are questions we have to answer now, like today. So I'm concerned about that. And I'm also, just to close, I'm very concerned about this ridiculous article that came out today saying that, where it was Dominic LeBlanc and the Trudeau Liberals saying that they'd be prepared to entertain legislation to, protect the Canadian public from, quote, misinformation on COVID. Well, who's the arbiter of truth? Is it the WHO? I hope not. Yeah. So very, very, these are things we all have to fight, again, regardless of who you vote for. It's ridiculous and it's an overreach.
And it seems to me that the main source of misinformation throughout this entire pandemic has in fact been the government and the WHO. So it is strange how they would hope to govern that policy.
I think, I don't want to paint everyone with a misinformation brush, because I'd be guilty of kind of what they're doing. I think that there have been in scenarios where public health officials have been working with the best of information available to them and have made decisions. But then there are clearly instances where common sense should have prevailed. Like, why did we allow a bunch of flights from a hot zone in the middle of an outbreak with no testing? Like, it's bananas, right? So, when we're looking to come out of this, we have to have a country that looks familiar to us at the end in sight. And that means that we don't sacrifice civil liberties, that we don't sacrifice privacy, that we don't sacrifice, our systems, our economic systems for, a new socialist regime. Under the auspices of the government, Big Brother is caring for you because of COVID. That's just not something that I'm willing to accept. And I don't think a lot of Canadians would be either.
Yeah. What was your reaction, and again, on the subject of overreach, the initial emergency legislation, when the Trudeau government asked for almost ultimate power, throwing away parliamentary sovereignty, until the end of 2021. It must have been an enormous shock.
I wasn't, actually. It was right on brand for the Trudeau Liberals. You have to go back to, this would have been early 2016, after the 2015 election, when one of the first orders of business of the Trudeau Liberal government was to review the standing orders or the rules of Parliament, right? And you'll remember, if you look back then, they wanted to eliminate a whole day of sitting every week. They didn't want us to work on Fridays. They didn't want the Prime Minister to show up to question period more than once a week. There were so many things that they wanted to change, and it was under the guise of work-life balance. But really what it was diminishing the role of Parliament in terms of its oversight of government. That is the role of Parliament, is to hold government to account, right? It's one of the major functions that we have.
Yeah.
So when when this legislation came out where they wanted, carte blanche, like to turn Canada essentially into a benevolent, quote, benevolent dictatorship, it wasn't a shock because it's been their modus operandi for years. And it shouldn't come as a shock to Canadians, but it's something that they have to understand, that by giving Justin Trudeau a mandate, you're going to see this. It's the same principle of the SNC-Lavalin scandal. It's the same principle of, shutting these committees down over and over again. I think about what would have happened if Stephen Harper had done any of these things. It would have been, riots and tear gas. Like, it would have been, just mass unrest in the streets because of, the assault on our democracy. So why is it okay if a socialist does it? It shouldn't be. Because if we allow one flavor of political stripe to destroy our democratic institutions, we've lost who we are as a country. And that is something we need to fight right now as part of our relaunch efforts coming out of this crisis, which need to start right away.
Yeah, but despite all these controversies, Justin Trudeau still continues to do well in the polls. And aside from the usual suspects, the media still continues to support him for the most part. Why hasn't there been a backlash? If you compare this to even a month ago, to the shutdown Canada protest, he could be a different prime minister in terms of support. It must be daunting.
Look, I look at polls with a very sort of, I always take polls with a grain of salt. First of all, obviously we could have a long conversation about methodology, but in a time of crisis, it is normal for an electorate or the Canadian public to look to their government for solutions, and then measure their response based on a different set of criteria than you would in peacetime, if you will, right? So, I think, again, going back to what we said, Trudeau's approval rating, I think, is a reflection as well on the fact that all political parties, mine included, work collaboratively to get emergency benefits and, as best we could, meet the needs of Canadians during a mass lockdown scenario. I think things are going to change going forward, depending on where the government goes from here, right? Mm-hmm. If the real question is, how do we come out of this? And that's where real leadership is going to be needed. And, you're going to see, again, like I've put forward a pretty meaty thought piece on that. I think our party is going to be, without sort of spilling details, we're going to be taking a very strong leadership, government in waiting position on how we're approaching this issue. But that's where I think that's where I will be more interested in polls is, if Trudeau just keeps saying we can't reopen the economy for months and weeks without talking about this, and people are starting to lose, their businesses day after day, they're not able to make ends meet, they're not able to sit on a patio or see their family for family gatherings, that's really where you're going to start seeing people say this is a failure. And I don't want a failure regardless of what the political outcome is. I want to make sure that people's needs are met. So that's where our focus is going to be.
Yes. Well, on the subjects on the government's in waiting, it must be quite difficult for Conservatives at the moment because you don't yet know who your leader is going to be, who's going to lead you into the next election. There were some rumours, and again, it seems like an awfully long time ago, that you were considering a run for the Conservative leadership bid. Was this ever, was that real?
I certainly had a lot of people ask me to consider it, and there's a, I probably could have been competitive if I had entered it. But when I entered politics, I, made a promise to myself and those that were closest to me that no matter what my position was or where I was, that I would always, no matter what, put the needs of my community first. And I just feel that at this point in time, the needs of Alberta and of my community are unique. We've seen a devastating economic downturn that has been deeply exacerbated by COVID, but we were already weak. I have to advocate for the needs of my community first. And the mechanics of our party is such that you need to, and it's not a bad thing. You need to build a broad-based voter coalition. But I am concerned about the fact that our leadership candidates really aren't commenting in great specificity on what they're going to do for Alberta and for Western Canada writ large. I think it's concerning, and it can't just be platitudes like, well, we're going to repeal Bill C-69 or C-48. There's broader systemic issues that are facing my part of the country. And I knew that if I was running for leader of the party, I would have to perhaps sacrifice my voice on that. And that's not something that I'm willing to do, because it's so dire where I live right now. So, the need for personal political gain in terms of leading a party, to me was less of a personal objective than being a vocal and vociferous advocate for the fact that Western Canada has a really raw deal right now. And not just, in terms of leadership in my party, but also within my party. That is not acceptable to turn a blind eye to. Like, we need dramatic and transformational change within Confederation to give Western Canada equal footing. So I'm happy to, at this juncture and at this moment in history, be that voice.
Right. And out of the current candidates, who do you think would be the best for Alberta?
I haven't heard anything from them, any of them, that is specific to that. So that's a challenge for them.
Sorry, would you endorse a candidate without them giving a proper plan for Alberta?
Absolutely not.
Really? Well, that's interesting. And again, it's a shame that so much has happened since the Buffalo Declaration, which you, of course, were a part of. But I wanted to ask you, how real is the threat of Western separatism? Is that something someone in Montreal or Toronto should be concerned about?
Of course it's something. I mean, that's the problem. Like, even just asking that question is part of the problem, is that to give you a sense of what my frame of reference is for this, I was very happy and pleased as a prominent member of the Conservative Party of Canada to really put a lot of my personal time and political effort into, paving the runway ahead of the last political campaign. I was in, well over, I think it was over 150 ridings across the country in the lead up to the election. I was in dozens of ridings during the writ. I kind of lost track. I couldn't give you a specific number, but the point being is I was in every corner of the country knocking on doors. And at some point I realized that I was having to go cap in hand to every part of the country saying, we need a change in government in order for my community to survive. And I started realizing how wrong that was. And your question, should Montreal and Toronto be concerned about Western alienation and, the sentiment that I'm expressing? If you care about Canada, you absolutely should be concerned about it. And I stand by every word that is in the Buffalo Declaration. I think it says a lot of things that are inconvenient for people to talk about. And, I certainly expected, and I think the people who signed on to it certainly expected criticism from the left and from the usual quarters that don't really care about Western Canada. But it's incumbent upon people who purport to stand for Western Canada to really be talking about the concepts that are outlined therein. You don't have to agree with everything. It was a thought piece in terms of saying, look, here's some ideas, here's some sentiments. How do we address some of these concerns? It was meant to provoke discussion, to say things are not okay. And I intend to keep doing that. That's why I was elected. I was first and foremost elected by my community to fight for them, and they need a voice right now, and I will give them a voice. I hope that the Conservative Party of Canada can be that vehicle, but the leadership process, the leadership candidates that are there right now, they need a statement on Western Canada that's more than repeal C-69 and C-48. There needs to be transformational change to give us an equitable voice in Confederation. And that's what I'm going to fight for.
What sort of change would you be looking for?
read the Buffalo Declaration. I spent a lot of time laying it out in
Well,
there.
I have. And one of the interesting points I found about the Buffalo Declaration was that you compared Alberta, or the group did, to a colony, or to say there was a colonial relationship between Western Canada and Ottawa. Now, that's a pretty strong word. And do you really think the actions of the previous governments, and in particular Liberal governments, have constituted a form of colonialism?
Well, when you look back to the history of Confederation, Buffalo, or what became Saskatchewan and Alberta, the acquisition of the land was never, and I want to start by acknowledging the lack of consultation of First Nations and the traditional territory contained therein. But there was no the purpose of the acquisition of that land by Canada ostensibly was not to have that part of our country be an equal partner. It was to ensure that the Americans wouldn't get it, essentially. I'm paraphrasing, and it was to ensure that the resources were there and used for the benefit of other parts of Canada. And that was born, witness was born to that by the efforts of legislators at the time to ensure that there was equal voice in legislative mechanisms that didn't occur. And we've seen policy, we've just seen history repeat itself virtually every generation since then, in terms of punitive policies that have never really allowed Western Canada to have an equal voice. And even, being part of Stephen Harper's cabinet, and I can say this with great admiration and respect, former Prime Minister Harper always sought cabinet to look at policy from the lens of every region of the country equitably. But the gains that we made in terms of equal voice and representation for Western Canada were erased in 3 months of Justin Trudeau taking power. And the welfare and well-being of the people in my province shouldn't be determined by the flavor of government. It should be determined by the status of our democratic systems. And I don't feel that those exist. And that's why, I spent a lot of time outlining what the radical transformation that I think needs to happen with regard to the Constitution and other mechanisms. And there'll be people who say, oh, Michelle, that's just not possible. It'll never happen. Well, why not? If we're a country and this is a problem, why wouldn't we be looking at this? I don't accept, well, we can't do it as an adequate answer. And I know that there are many people in my province who militantly feel the same way. And today, we're sitting here talking in the middle of the COVID crisis when you can buy a barrel of Western Canadian Select for about the same price as a fancy coffee, because of the punitive, there's a decline in demand and you've got the Saudi Russian price war, whatever, but there's also the fact that there's a delta between that price and world price because of the policies the most recent Liberal government has put in place, which has prevented us from getting energy infrastructure. And even I'm reading these newspaper articles like, well, we shouldn't be bailing out the energy sector because, we need to transition to meaningful work. Can you imagine if I said that about a Quebec industry? Mm-hmm. It would be morally repugnant to the, elite class in central Canada. So why is it not morally repugnant to say that about my industry and the people that work in it who are proud to work in it? So I'm tired of this. I am deeply frustrated. And it is my job as a legislator to boldly voice those frustrations. And I did, and I stand by them. I stand by that proudly.
Yeah. What policy of Trudeau's do you think has pushed Western alienation to this point? Are there particular policies you think, was it always was underlying?
It's a cumulative impact. I think, what I have to give him credit for is he was smarter than his father in not calling it National Energy Plan, the sequel, I'm Finishing the Job, starring Justin Trudeau II. But, I could go through all the energy sector policies, equalization, again, I tried to list in the Buffalo Declaration sort of the inequities, the structural inequities that have been exacerbated by policy declarations. And I don't want to give the sense that it's just about the energy sector, because it's not. It's about the fact that we are told what is good for us, rather than saying, well, you don't get to decide that, big brother in Ottawa, right? We're not equally represented in the public service, in the bureaucracy, in the lobbyist community, and in all of these power centers that influence decision-making in Ottawa. And it's a complex issue. That's why, that document is meaty and it's weighty, but it's to show anybody who's interested in, who thinks that what we're facing in Western Canada is just a policy response, or a response to the energy sector. It's much broader than that. And I do think that my party is the only one who's sort of talking about this, but we need more, much more.
Mm-hmm. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. For this time. Absolutely. And, if you're ever in Montreal, perhaps we can do this in person one day.
Fantastic. A beautiful city.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Bye-bye.